Okay. Oh, good. Can you all hear me? Fantastic. Right. So yes, the name Cambridge today is a bit in the news, isn't it? And absolutely not attached to me. And the irony, of course, is that the company in the news isn't attached to Cambridge in any sense of the word. It was renamed when it took on the Trump campaign by Steve Bannon. And I don't believe any of the founders, certainly none of the offices, have got anything to do with Cambridge. So it's a very unfortunate thing for somebody speaking from Cambridge to then have that running on in the background. I want to talk to you today, obviously about international growth and culture, but I want to come at it from my background, which is in neuroscience and psychology. Try and explain to you why this is an exciting time for people like me to get on stage, which is the first part. Then talk a little bit about what we understand about customers, because it's really surprising how much detail, how much psychological understanding we now have of how people process information, how they make decisions, and how important it is to be able to understand that to communicate with them well. From there, you can actually then start to ask questions which are really interesting, like, well, what is a culture? Because if you're going to internationalize your brand, you're asking the question, how does my brand operate in a different culture? And in order to answer that question, we really need a good way of describing what a culture is so that we can measure whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing with your brands and your e-commerce sites. And then I'll run through a couple of examples of things and also a couple of things not to do at the end. Okay, so I'm going to start with just a little bit I'm going to try and break your thinking a little bit. The first is just to talk about the brain before I talk about myself. So I know at conferences like this, there's always talk about big data and the increases in computing power and isn't AI marvelous, etc., etc. And I just wanted to put something on a scale for you. So when I started out in computers, so I actually started in the oil industry in data visualization and helping people to see information better. The fastest supercomputer in the world was the Cray 2. It weighed 72 tons. It had nitrogen-cooled cores. It couldn't fit in this room, and it's roughly the power of an iPhone 5 and not really a match for whatever you've got in your pocket today. Okay? So the fact that we're blown away by technology is not surprising. But if I reset that and say the smartphone in your pocket today is the equivalent of a walking pace. And if you were to walk from here to Sydney, it would take about a year. As your foot touched the pavement on your first step, your brain would have gone around the world 200,000 times. What our brains can do is astronomical compared to what we talk about technologically or in terms of artificial intelligence or computation. In those few seconds that a customer is looking at an e-commerce site, at a screen, at a product, and trying to decide what they're going to do, they process more information than a laptop can in 1500 years. So one of the first things we really need to do is not underestimate the customer in terms of what they're processing and what they're thinking. Whatever we look at, even when we look at something like shampoo, we process a huge amount of information to do with who we are, how does that fit with my life, what do I want, what's next? Those kinds of questions are so complicated that there are no artificial systems on Earth that can simulate the way we do that. One of the most interesting things in my job is that I've found out that the more trivial something looks, usually the more interesting it is. So the way, for instance, that people pick cosmetics is far more sophisticated than the way they decide which, for instance, political issues they're going to get involved in. Okay? So it's quite fascinating. So why should you listen to me at all? I suppose a bit of background, where have I come from? And I'm kind of doing this today as well because it feels timely. My journey started, believe it or not, as a researcher under Stephen Hawking, who obviously passed away. And I was very lucky to have that inspiration in my life early on. He actually, it sounds rather odd, I was inspired by what he was doing, but also inspired to move out of physics at the same time. So I met Stephen Hawking, I started working with him very shortly afterwards, I left physics, but he gave me the nub of something, a different approach at looking at the way the world is put together and look at information, and I took that into the world of neuroscience. Started to come up with some new ideas, and those ideas were all about real-world decision making. So I spent a little bit of time in academia, then I raised money actually in the oil markets and built a company that was all around data visualization and learning how to map somebody's psychology so that we could present information to them better. So if you imagine drilling an oil well, it's hugely expensive. If the geophysicist can see where the oil is, that's worth like £10 million than if they don't. Right? Because you put a well down, it's instantly a lot of money that goes into the ground. So there was a lot of money in it. We did a lot of research and we learned a lot about mapping how the brain operates. I went from there into things like defense and threat analysis and then into education. So why on earth did I then make this right turn from education into marketing? Because right now we have something really exciting going on with consumers. You might not be excited about it, but I am. And that's that we have an information democracy, that they can choose what messages they're going to consume and what they're going to block. And they're getting very discerning. And we now can't just push a TV advert out in the hope that it will hit millions of people. We now have to compete against this vast noise in the background and convince a consumer to consume our product. Okay, and that for me was the driving force of coming into marketing, into consumer research. The other thing is that in education we've got a very formal way of doing things, and actually that holds you back. If you start looking at those decisions like how we vote in politics, which is actually rather simple and bogged down. And what's really interesting is, most fascinating in the brain, is what happens to a consumer when they stand in front of a shelf of shampoo. That's far more interesting. Or if they're online and they're going through Amazon and they're looking at products, what's going on in their brain? There's far more interesting things going on than when we actually think about what we're teaching in the classroom, which I think is a bit of an irony. Okay, so I want to change how you look at people and what they do. And this is a nice video that shows that principle.
Petter Johansson is forcing people to make decisions.
This one.
It's a simple enough task for most people, and in fact, it isn't the real point of the experiment.
Why did you prefer that one?
Higher cheekbones, slightly better hair.
This is all quite boring, until you look at the experiment from a different perspective.
This one.
Watch carefully. The volunteer chooses the card on the left,
This one.
but Petter swaps the card and presents the photo that was seen on the right and was actually rejected.
It is a card trick, but it's a cheap card trick, based on something that the magicians just call black on black. So for each card, there's a hidden card behind it, which is actually the opposite one. Where we slide the other card over, the black card is hidden. And then Petter just uses his arm to slide it down into his lap.
I mean, it's two parts that's interesting here. First, the fact that they don't notice when you switch the pictures. It's interesting in itself, and it's quite surprising. And the second part is, of course, the verbal reports they give, that they actually motivate choices they didn't make.
80% of the people we tested had absolutely no idea that a switch had been made.
Again, this one just struck me. Interesting shot. Since I'm a photographer, I like the way it's lit and looks.
I cut that together from the BBC, and the thing that I love is the photographer at the end telling you how he knows about imagery and he's just been duped. That's a process called choice blindness. So the minute I can convince you that you've made a choice, and then you will remember making that choice and you will believe that you made that choice. And as long as it's a convincing enough situation, that will actually happen to you. The reason that I wanted to show that is I always have these three statements about what goes on in your brains. The first is that given long enough, I can show you that green is blue and blue is red, and that a rectangle is a square and a circle is a square, and in fact you're not really seeing what's in front of you. So what we think perception is not as absolute. That's an example of about our memories, that our memories are not really about what happened. It's not a hard disk of things that happened to us. It's a prediction about what happened to us in the past. We predict our pasts. And we do it with very, very good accuracy, but it is a prediction. And that's why I can convince you that if I convince you well enough that you made a choice, you will remember making it, because predictably that's what your brain will fill in. So 90% of what you remember that you did today, you never actually did at all. You're just simply predicting that in the past. And the third element is how we rationalize. So actually what happens in your brain is it breathes, just like you do. And when it breathes, it's got 100 billion different computers inside of it, and they all go in different directions and consider what you're doing in 100 billion ways. And then as you breathe out, they all come together to one so that we can make a choice and move forward. What's interesting is that we don't have access to that. So what we do is we make up a single set of logic of what connects A to B. We rationalize it. And you can show very, very easily in psychology that what we rationalize has got absolutely nothing to do with why we make a choice in the first place. So this is quite ironic when you think about things like focus groups or interviews, where we ask consumers what they think and they tell us what they've rationalized, which is absolutely not what they thought at all. Not because they're trying to lie to us, because they simply don't know. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you is why it's so important to understand your customer psychologically. And I was hoping there would be a volunteer. You'll keep smiling at me, so I'm thinking you're a volunteer. Can you come up just for a second? You might have to shout, unfortunately, which I won't have to. Okay, so you are? Fabian. Great. Hop on up. So, Fabian, what does your company sell? Cosmetics. Okay. Now, you know, I want you to think of two friends or family members that perhaps use your product, perhaps not, but you need to convince them to use your product. Yeah? So, can you picture those two people? You immediately go, right, I want to convince them to use my product. Yeah? Okay, so you don't need to give them names, but what would you do to convince the first person that they wanted to use your product? You just give them the product. Yeah. And what would you do with the second person?
The second person, I would tell them a story.
You tell them a story. What story would you tell them? Why would you tell them a story?
Why would I tell them a story?
Yeah, if you really had to convince them. Oh, thank you. So if your life depended on it, that these two people had to use this product, what would you be doing?
Well, I mean, look, I'm so confident in the quality of the product for the first person that I'd give them the product because it doesn't exist. It's
so you think they just try
the
it?
first person.
You think they get in there and they try the product?
As soon as they have it in their hands, they're going to love it, treat it like jewelry. It's going to
Okay.
be very valuable, and then I'll ask for it back, and then they can have a conversation.
Okay.
It's first
So you take it back. So you give it to them, they try it, you take it back.
Yes.
Right. Okay. What about the second
and
person?
the second person, I tell them a story.
You tell them a story.
I tell them a story about the problems that they have.
Right.
I think that's
So you'd
quite
have to convince them more. You tell them a story specifically about whatever issue it is. And the reason I'm not drilling in is I don't want to hear every detail about your personal life.
But you know,
or put it on
essentially, I'm
stage.
creating a need.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like
Okay.
a basic marketing thing, right?
Okay. But you didn't do that with the first person.
I didn't do that with the first
No.
person because they're two
Okay.
different.
So you instinctively knew that you needed to do two different things with two different people, right? And actually, if you think about your product, sorry, I've finished. Thank you very much. So if you think about your product genuinely and selling it to somebody, if your life depended on it, the more you understand them, actually, if you started going into that story, you tell a different story. It's not just about giving them the product, it's how you give them the product. And you took it back because you knew that if they lost it, that was more of a powerful force for them than the wish to have it in the first place. That they were up for trying it, they were experimental, but it only became a desire when you took it away. So what you've discovered straight away is that you instinctively know that the psychology of the person you're dealing with is the most important factor in selling them anything that you want to sell them, right? I didn't need to ask you, if we started talking about their age, if we started talking about their job, if we started talking about their income, if we started talking about their postcode, none of that would be very illuminating in comparison to your understanding of those people and how to convince them. Yeah. So how much can we really glean about a person and how to convince them? This is a picture which depicts, how many people in here would say they work in marketing or near marketing? Just so I can see. So quite a lot of you. This is a picture of your brains. Okay. So we did a survey with Marketing Week recently. And that survey literally mapped out the ways in which you put ideas together. Okay? And why have I put this on screen? Because you can see that every white dot is a psychological relationship. It's where something is related to something else. It tells you how to nuance something, what kind of imagery someone might respond to, whether they need copy to be more succinct or slightly more poetic, whether you should put numbers in it or whether you shouldn't. But that's each of those dots is telling you something, and specifically an area. So it could say, look, if I'm talking to you as marketers about email, then I really should put lots of numbers in this and there should be bullets. But actually your psychology changes when you're thinking about content marketing and you want me to completely change the way that I'm communicating with you. And that's what we're doing, mapping them out. And if you look into some of the detailing, there's some really intricate structures. I put the URL at the bottom if you want to sort of take a pass at it. But what I wanted to show you was simply how much information you can actually gather. And once you've got this kind of understanding, you literally can, on an individual basis, so we can pick this up on an individual basis, craft a message specifically for that person. What's interesting is you don't have to do it on a one-on-one basis. In fact, you can then go to things like segmentation models and deal with people much more manageably, but your messaging is targeted really well. It's also, of course, really useful in e-commerce. What products should you be showing? How should you be talking about them? The adaptations you can make are huge. Just showing you how this came out, I thought if there are enough marketers in the room, you might be interested. So when you pull that kind of data, you can then look at how people polarize, and you can look at their natural groups. This is something I hope you're quite familiar with in the workplace. It's a polarization characteristic. We all fall along this spectrum, but actually marketers tend to head out towards the edges here. Are they empathizers or are they analyzers? Do they value talent? Do they talk about creativity? Do they talk about data? And what's interesting is you see some of these properties from people, but it's hard to know some of the other ones unless you really dig in. And this table could go down for 50, 60, 70 different properties about what changes in people's behavior and the way they consume content and what they want based on how they fit on that scale. And something like this would be a scale that you'd have 4 or 5 different dimensions, and then you could target your audience by understanding the articles they're reading, etc. Okay. So that's brilliant, but it has nothing to do with international growth at the moment or culture. So what is culture, right? So if you understand the fundamental property of selling anything is getting somebody enthused, it's actually connecting ideas together. It's very little about telling them something new, because if we tell somebody something new, it's very hard for them to get their head around. And even when we tell someone something new, what we tend to do is try and make that into things they already know and then build up from there. So whenever we want to communicate with someone, we're connecting ideas together. And what culture is, simply put in a neuroscience term, is that we all have a similar way of putting ideas together. And that allows us to have a conversation without each side getting thoroughly confused. If I look at something like politics for a second, what's interesting is that if you ask the right questions, everybody agrees on everything. Right? If I ask somebody, is it important to protect somebody who's vulnerable in society with the social security net? Is it important that if somebody's lost their job and they've been hard working all their life, they should get job seekers an allowance or some kind of safety net around them? Everybody will say yes. If you say, are there situations in which people wrongly claim these benefits? Is it a problem? Does it cost the taxpayer? Should we do something about it? Everybody says yes. The only difference is the strength or the value that we place on things and the strength in which we connect ideas together. So culture is really that shared sense of how we connect things together and therefore how we consume them. So I used Unilever as the first example just simply because it was a very, very interesting switch. They were selling the same product in bottles. I don't know how many of you know this in India, but in the rural districts, it was very hard for anybody to have enough money to buy a whole bottle of shampoo. So they produced sachets, which were far more expensive per unit of shampoo, but were really affordable, sort of less than a penny to buy a sachet. And suddenly, they got massive market traction because there's obviously utility, but it was the way people looked at it. You could say that individual could have saved up for a period of time and then bought shampoo, but they never would have thought of shampoo like that. Those two ideas don't connect. I save up and I buy shampoo. For them, I want shampoo, it's a treat, I want it now. And it's understanding that difference and then changing your product, which is interesting. So it's not so much about that it made it more affordable, it actually made it less affordable but more accessible in terms of mentally more accessible for them. Coca-Cola is another interesting example of somebody who changed their commercial way of operating in a different environment. So in this case, when they were in Africa, they needed to distribute their product. And the standard way is you kind of build a shop and people come to the shop, and there's a sense in which our culture, our understanding of where you get a drink and what you do is that way aligned. In Africa, it's not like that. For a start, you've got to walk too many miles to the shop. And what happens is you have lots of small entrepreneurs selling drinks. And all they did was to plug into that marketplace, and they had a massive response. But again, they organized themselves around the way people expected to buy the product and the way the culture operated. So it's obvious we need to change based on a culture. What I want to do now is just show you a little bit about how finely can you actually tune that, and then talk a little bit about how you can tune it in reality. So I wanted to take I was sort of scurrying around this morning because I wanted to take an example from e-commerce, and this is a map, a psychological map, or a portion, because I didn't feel I should put up the whole map. So I've taken a couple of portions from an e-commerce publisher, right? So one of the biggest players who's selling published materials online, and it's a map of their audience, and it's a map of their audience in the US versus China. Okay, now what I want you to see straight away is that there are features on these visuals that are similar. So you can see that we've got some similarities between the two audiences, and that's quite interesting. But then the next question is there difference? Can you actually zone in and see culture and its effect and impact on the consumer's behavior and the way they relate to that brand? So all of these questions, all of these factors that I'm showing you are specifically how that consumer relates and puts ideas together around that brand. And the answer is yes, you can. The features that you of course noticed were all the connecting features, and the features that you miss are the difference between the two cultures. So there's some really important points to that when you start looking at it. The first is, as brands, we tend to try and stay as consistent as possible. And to an extent that does work for us, but it also means that we're much more aware of the consistency of what we need to be doing in different markets than what changes. All right. The other thing you can see is that difference is actually a lot smaller than what connects people. I always find this quite interesting. We get asked, if you did that piece of research in China as opposed to the US, which of course we did, this was global, how different would people think about your brands? How different would they consume that information in the US over China? And the answer is about 10% differently. It's not massive. The biggest difference is between personality types, between the types of people that access your audience, and 10% is about culture. Okay, so I don't want to lose sight of the fact that people are people. Cultures are kind of aggregations of the way we organize the world, but they are not as important as understanding individuals. So yes, you can see the differences between the two cultures. Now, what does that practically mean? It could practically mean a number of things. Say you were in an e-commerce funnel, for instance, and you wanted to know how to organize that funnel, different steps, if you like, messages in order to push the consumer along. So what does it mean if somebody scrolls down instead of clicks in? How many clicks on that item, or the kind of behaviors you might be interpreting, and then you've got to react to that and push, say, products that you think are similar, messages to buy, whether you're going to look at other circulating advertising, to look at offers that could induce. How do you know when to do that and not to do that? And the answer, it can be different depending on culture, because the way that consumer will organize that information together is very different. Right? So the answer is yes, you can map it, and you can map it at incredible detail as to what people are thinking and feeling. Now, without getting into a specific industry, it's very hard for me to do. I'm going to take you through just a little bit of some of the big players that do this well. And hopefully this will translate. So I've used an example of things that are publicly available in this case, because I can't show an ins and outs for a client of exactly how they do this on a culture by culture basis. So if you look at Nike, their whole thing was it's aspirational. Essentially, who is this aspirational figure, this athletic man or woman that's sitting in the Nike trainers? And what they did was then to psychologically work out how people aspire to that image and all the properties of it. So I thought this was one of the nicest top-level summaries I've ever seen, certainly publicly, for this kind of information. And it was done for Nike. And you can see straight away how they've changed the way in which they create that messaging, that driving force. Because when you go onto Nike, obviously you're not just functionally buying a trainer with a set of benefits, you're buying into an image. Now, if you then think about the types of trainers and the images they're going to use and how they're going to structure the journeys and which trainers are going to come at the top and the bottom of those searches, if you look at those different SKUs culturally, you can see immediately that you're going to get a difference in the way they organize that site. You know, where are they going to drive the consumer? What are they going to put on their homepage? What kinds of offers? As you get into the basket, what comes first in terms of product features or benefits or photos, etc.? You're going to shift depending on what this grid is telling you to do. If it's supposed to be strategic and prudent, it's not going to be the same as egoistic and proud, right? So the very skew in which the way that decision is made and that content is consumed is different. So if I was Nike selling trainers, which I'm not, I would very much think differently. If I just pick on these 2 points, I would think very differently about how I laid out my product page depending on what elements, how I would arrange those elements and how I would design those elements. Yes, I would want my designer to have a cultural background in the sort of thematics of design in that area, but most importantly, I want that psychological flow to be right. If somebody is selecting on being strategic and prudent, then they're going to go through things in a very different order than if they are egoistic and proud. Now, hopefully that makes quite a bit of sense in terms of how you would do that. So if you can measure the culture, you understand the nuances, you can create tables like this, you can get a lot more specific, and then you can customize to that. I want to use an opposite example though, just to finish, because as I said, I want you to think about what connects as well as what differentiates. This was a campaign that was run for Justin Bieber, and it broke the global streaming record in 2016. I know quite a lot about this campaign, and it was very much understanding Bieber culture. So you probably know that at that period of time, Justin Bieber, big fans I'm sure, was tanking a little bit. They were built up, and this was actually released at the point of his new song in September. And what they did is they keyed very cleverly into the way the audience was talking and understood the culture around Bieber, and this is globally, linked into it, used social listening, and then drove this experience that was all about stream to unlock, basically. Put this onto your Spotify to unlock it. And they drove and drove and drove by understanding the culture around Bieber, and they broke the global streaming record by 150%, which is absolutely huge. I think it was 26 million streams in day one. So in that case, that was not about understanding culture as in a location. It was understanding culture around an individual. Bieber fans, believers, have their own culture. And mapping that culture had a massive gain for those individuals. I believe I'm being waved at and I'm out of time, so I better stop there.